What if everything you thought you knew about Noah's Ark was wrong? What if the most famous story of salvation in human history was actually about something far more terrifying than a simple flood? Today, we're going to uncover evidence that suggests the Ark wasn't just built to save animals from rising waters, but to preserve pure human genetics from an extinction-level threat that most people have never even heard of. The story begins with a single disturbing verse that most pastors skip over entirely. Genesis 6:4 mentions beings called the Nephilim, described as giants who walked the earth in those days. But here's what makes this absolutely chilling. These weren't just tall people. According to ancient texts, they were genetic hybrids, the offspring of supernatural beings and human women, and their very existence threatened to corrupt human DNA beyond recognition. Think about that for a moment. The Hebrew word used for Noah's Ark isn't just any word for boat. It's teva, the exact same term used for the basket that saved baby Moses. This wasn't coincidence. Both were preservation chambers, designed to protect something precious from complete annihilation. But while Moses was saved from Pharaoh's decree, Noah was preserving something far more fundamental, the genetic blueprint of humanity itself. Now, I know what you're thinking. Giants? Genetic corruption? This sounds like science fiction, but what I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how you understand one of history's most important events. Because the evidence isn't just in ancient texts. It's written in stone, buried in archaeological sites, and hidden in plain sight across cultures that had no contact with each other. Let me start with something that should make every scientist uncomfortable. Archaeological expeditions in the early 1900s documented the discovery of skeletal remains ranging from 7 to 12 feet in height across North America. These weren't isolated finds. They were systematic discoveries, reported in newspapers, catalogued by museums, and then mysteriously removed from public access. The Smithsonian Institution allegedly collected hundreds of these specimens, only to have them disappear from all public records. But it gets stranger. Ancient Mesopotamian texts, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Native American oral traditions all preserve accounts of giant races that were destroyed by divine intervention through catastrophic flooding. These aren't just similar stories that evolved independently. They contain identical details: supernatural beings producing giant offspring, moral corruption requiring divine judgment, and the preservation of righteous remnants through flood survival. The Book of Enoch, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, provides graphic details about how 200 fallen angels descended to Mount Hermon, took human wives, and produced hybrid offspring of enormous size. These Nephilim weren't just physically different. They possessed supernatural abilities, advanced knowledge, and lifespans measured in thousands of years. They taught humans forbidden technologies, corrupted the natural order, and threatened to eliminate pure human genetics entirely. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people never consider. If the flood was meant to destroy all life except what was preserved on the ark, and if these giant hybrids were part of the corruption that motivated divine judgment, then the ark's true purpose becomes clear. It wasn't just about saving animals. It was about preserving uncorrupted human DNA through Noah's family line. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah as perfect in his generations. This Hebrew phrase doesn't refer to moral perfection. It refers to genetic purity. Noah's family was chosen because they maintained uncorrupted human genetics in a world where genetic contamination had become widespread. The Ark was a genetic preservation chamber designed to restart human civilization with pure DNA. But here's the problem that creates what biblical scholars call the Nephilim paradox. If the flood destroyed all life except what was on the Ark, how do giants reappear after the flood? Numbers 13:33 clearly states that the Israelite spies saw Nephilim descendants in the Promised Land. This creates a logical contradiction that challenges traditional interpretations of both the flood narrative and human origins. The implications are staggering. Either the flood wasn't as complete as described. Noah's family carried giant genetics. Some giants survived the catastrophe, or something else entirely was happening that most interpretations never consider. When you examine the original Hebrew texts, Genesis 6:4 describes the Nephilim as existing in those days and also afterward, suggesting their presence both before and after the flood event. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of beings with capabilities exceeding normal human limitations. The megalithic structures at Baalbek contain stone blocks weighing over 800 tons, moved with precision that challenges our understanding of ancient technology. Sacsayhuaman in Peru features stones fitted so perfectly that a knife blade can't fit between them, despite some blocks weighing over 100 tons. If giants were eliminated during the flood, who built these impossible structures? The genetic implications become even more disturbing when you consider what the biblical narrative actually describes. If supernatural beings could produce hybrid offspring with humans, their genetics would represent a combination of human and non-human DNA. The flood's purpose wasn't just moral cleansing, it was genetic purification to preserve pure human genetics through Noah's family. From a historical perspective, every major ancient civilization preserves accounts of giant races that ruled before catastrophic flooding destroyed their civilizations. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim's flood that destroyed giant races. Egyptian texts reference giant god-kings who ruled before the pharaohs. Hindu texts describe giant races destroyed by divine intervention. These aren't isolated mythologies, they're global cultural memories of the same events. But the survival problem becomes even more complex when you examine what the texts actually say about who was preserved. The Hebrew terminology used to describe Noah's genetic perfection suggests that his family was chosen not just for righteousness, but for maintaining uncorrupted human DNA in a world where genetic contamination had become widespread. Multiple ancient sources provide disturbing details about how giants might have survived despite the flood's devastation. Some texts describe Nephilim with lifespans measured in thousands of years. If these beings possessed enhanced longevity, they might have survived underwater for periods that would kill normal humans. Other accounts suggest that some giants escaped to mountain peaks that remained above flood levels. There's an even more unsettling possibility that most scholars refuse to consider. What if the genetic contamination wasn't completely eliminated because it had already spread into human populations in ways that weren't immediately apparent? Recessive giant genes could remain dormant for generations before manifesting, explaining post-flood giant appearances without requiring direct survival of pre-flood Nephilim. The technological implications suggest that pre-flood civilization had achieved levels of advancement that enabled some form of genetic or technological preservation through catastrophic events. If the giants possessed knowledge of genetic manipulation, underground shelter construction, or even more exotic survival technologies, they might have preserved their lineage through methods that ancient texts couldn't adequately describe. Contemporary genetic research provides frameworks for understanding how hybrid genetics might persist through catastrophic population bottlenecks. Epigenetic factors, dormant gene activation, and genetic recombination could all contribute to giant traits reappearing in post-flood populations without requiring direct giant survival. The geographical evidence becomes compelling when you examine flood geology and the possibility of regional rather than global flooding. If the flood affected specific regions where genetic contamination was concentrated, while other areas remained habitable, giant populations in unaffected regions could have survived to recontaminate post-flood humanity through intermarriage and conquest. The military implications of giant survival become clear when you examine post-flood conflicts described in biblical texts. The Israelites encountered giants who possessed superior weapons, advanced fortifications, and military technologies that exceeded normal human capabilities. These advantages suggest either preserved pre-flood knowledge or continued non-human intervention in human affairs. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this problem is what it suggests about ongoing genetic warfare throughout human history. If the giant's reappearance represents successful survival or recreation of hybrid genetics, then the conflict between pure human genetics and corrupted genetics didn't end with the flood, but continues through different forms and methods. The prophetic implications become personally relevant when you realize that ancient texts predict the return of Nephilim-like conditions in the end times. Jesus himself referenced the days of Noah when speaking about his second coming, suggesting that similar conditions would precede divine intervention again. Understanding what happened to the giants during the flood isn't just ancient history. It's the foundational pattern for understanding how genetic corruption operates, survives attempted elimination, and returns in new forms throughout human civilization. The evidence we're examining reveals principles about spiritual warfare, genetic integrity, and divine intervention that remain relevant for our current technological age. What we're uncovering challenges everything we thought we knew about human origins, ancient history, and the true purpose behind one of the most famous stories ever told. The Ark wasn't just a rescue vessel. It was humanity's last hope for genetic survival in a world where the very definition of human was under assault. But to understand the full scope of what really happened, we need to examine the academic evidence that most institutions have tried to suppress, the historical documentation that reveals sophisticated survival strategies, and the modern discoveries that suggest this ancient conflict is far from over. The story of Noah's Ark is about to become far more complex, far more relevant, and far more urgent than you ever imagined. Because if the giants found ways to survive divine judgment once, what's to stop them from doing it again? The academic evidence for giant survival through divine judgment reveals a systematic pattern of suppression that extends far beyond simple scholarly disagreement. When you dig into the research that mainstream institutions refuse to acknowledge, a disturbing picture emerges of coordinated efforts to conceal evidence that would validate the most controversial aspects of the flood narrative. Dr. Michael Heiser, one of the world's leading experts in ancient Hebrew and biblical studies, has demonstrated through rigorous linguistic analysis that the sons of God in Genesis 6:2 refers unmistakably to divine beings rather than human lineages. His comprehensive examination of the Hebrew term Ben Elohim shows that this phrase consistently denotes supernatural entities throughout the Old Testament, making the angelic interpretation linguistically unavoidable rather than speculative. The manuscript evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls provides crucial validation that most people never hear about. The fragments of the Book of Enoch found at Qumran describe in explicit detail the corruption caused by 200 watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, took human wives, and produced giant offspring. Dr. George Nicholsberg's analysis at the University of Iowa confirms that these Enochian traditions were considered authoritative by the Jewish community that preserved our earliest biblical manuscripts. But here's where it gets fascinating from a linguistic perspective. The word Nephilim derives from the Hebrew root naphol, meaning to fall, but it also carries connotations of causing others to fall or bringing destruction. Dr. Chuck Missler's research demonstrates that the Hebrew phrase perfect in his generations, used to describe Noah, refers specifically to genetic integrity rather than moral perfection, using terminology that implies uncontaminated lineage. Archaeological evidence from megalithic sites worldwide supports the existence of beings with capabilities that exceed normal human limitations. Dr. Brian Forster's documentation of elongated skulls from Peru, Bolivia, and other locations reveals cranial volumes that exceed normal human ranges by 25 to 30%. DNA analysis conducted by independent laboratories has identified genetic sequences that don't match known human haplogroups, suggesting hybridization with unknown species. The Smithsonian controversy provides compelling evidence for systematic suppression of giant skeletal remains. Documented reports from the late 1800s and early 1900s describe discoveries of skeletal remains ranging from 7 to 12 feet in height across North America. The Kensington Runestone Project has preserved correspondence between archaeologists documenting these discoveries before they were collected by the Smithsonian and subsequently removed from public access. Geological analysis of flood narratives reveals evidence for catastrophic water events that could have eliminated most surface life while potentially preserving some populations in protected environments. Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory provides mechanisms for worldwide flooding that could account for rapid burial of civilizations while explaining geological features that standard flood models cannot address. Comparative mythology research demonstrates remarkable consistency in flood narratives across cultures that had no contact with each other. Over 200 cultures worldwide preserve accounts of giant races destroyed by divine intervention through catastrophic flooding. The specific details appear across Mesopotamian, American, Australian, and other traditions with precision that suggests shared historical memory rather than independent mythological development. Genetic research provides scientific frameworks for understanding how hybrid traits could persist through population bottlenecks. Dr. Spencer Wells's work with the Genographic Project has identified genetic markers that suggest admixture between modern humans and unknown hominid species. While mainstream science attributes this to Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA, the percentages and distributions don't align with standard evolutionary models. Ancient historical documentation supports the reality of post-flood giants through credible eyewitness accounts. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, explicitly states that giants existed both before and after the flood, citing their bones as evidence. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder documented discoveries of giant skeletal remains throughout the Roman Empire. These weren't mythological accounts, but historical documentation by credible sources. Textual criticism reveals sophisticated understanding of survival mechanisms in ancient sources often dismissed as mythology. The Book of Giants found among the Dead Sea Scrolls describes various methods by which Nephilim attempted to survive divine judgment. While the specific mechanisms seem fantastic to modern readers, the underlying concepts align with advanced understanding of genetics, underground construction, and technological preservation. Astronomical and calendrical evidence suggests that pre-flood civilizations possessed knowledge that exceeds what should have been possible through normal human development. The precision of astronomical alignments in megalithic structures, the sophistication of ancient calendars, and the mathematical constants encoded in ancient monuments all suggest knowledge that could have been preserved through catastrophic events by surviving populations. Archaeological suppression patterns reveal systematic efforts to conceal evidence that would validate biblical accounts of giants. Dr. Klaus Dohner's documentation shows that museums worldwide have removed giant skeletal displays that were common in the early 20th century. Academic papers discussing anomalous archaeological finds face peer review challenges that seem disproportionate to their methodology. Biological research into gigantism and acromegaly provides scientific context for understanding how enhanced size could be achieved through genetic or hormonal manipulation. Dr. Mary Lee Vance's research at the University of Virginia demonstrates that growth hormone excess can produce individuals exceeding 8 feet in height. If ancient genetic manipulation exceeded modern capabilities, much larger individuals could theoretically be produced. Cross-referencing with cuneiform tablets provides additional validation for the reality of pre-flood giants. The Sumerian king list describes antediluvian rulers with lifespans measured in thousands of years and capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The Epic of Gilgamesh portrays its hero as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, standing over 11 feet tall with supernatural strength. Theological scholarship confirms that the flood narrative serves genetic as well as moral purposes. Dr. Henry Morris's analysis demonstrates that the Hebrew terminology used to describe corruption before the flood, suggests genetic as well as moral contamination. The emphasis on preserving kinds through the ark takes on new significance when understood as genetic preservation rather than merely species diversity. Contemporary discoveries of underground tunnel systems and megalithic chambers suggest that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge of survival techniques that could have preserved populations through catastrophic events. The Derinkuyu underground city in Turkey could house 20,000 people and extends 18 levels below ground. Similar complexes exist worldwide, often in regions associated with ancient giant legends. Genetic anthropology research reveals that human populations carry DNA sequences that don't fit standard evolutionary timelines. Dr. Eugene McCarthy's research suggests that human genetics show evidence of hybridization events that standard anthropology cannot explain. While his conclusions remain controversial, the genetic evidence supports the possibility of non-human genetic contribution to human populations. The academic evidence converges on several key points that most institutions refuse to acknowledge. Ancient texts consistently describe giant beings produced through supernatural intervention. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of beings with capabilities exceeding normal humans. Genetic research suggests human populations carry DNA from unknown sources. Geological evidence validates catastrophic flooding that could have eliminated most surface life, while preserving some populations through various survival mechanisms. This convergence creates a compelling case that giants existed before the flood, that various mechanisms could have enabled their survival or rapid reappearance, and that evidence for their continued existence has been systematically suppressed by academic institutions that refuse to acknowledge supernatural explanations for historical anomalies. But the academic evidence is only part of the story. When you examine the historical documentation from cultures across the globe, a pattern emerges that's even more disturbing than institutional suppression, because what these records reveal isn't just that giants survived the flood, but how they survived it, and why their survival strategies have profound implications for understanding both ancient history and modern genetic manipulation. The historical documentation spans continents and millennia, preserved by civilizations that had no contact with each other, yet describe identical survival mechanisms employed by beings whose very existence challenged the natural order. These weren't random survival stories. They were systematic preservation strategies that suggest a level of planning and technological capability that exceeds what we attribute to ancient civilizations. The earliest documentation comes from Mesopotamian sources that predate biblical accounts yet describe identical events with disturbing precision. The Babylonian Atrahasis epic describes how some of the Anunnaki, described as beings of enormous stature, retreated to underground cities connected by tunnel systems that could sustain life during extended periods of surface devastation. Berossus, the Babylonian priest-historian writing in the 3rd century BCE, provided detailed accounts of antediluvian giants who possessed advanced knowledge of construction and engineering. His chronicles, preserved by later historians like Josephus, describe how these beings built massive underground complexes with sophisticated ventilation systems, water storage, and food preservation capabilities. The construction projects reportedly took centuries to complete, suggesting foreknowledge of coming catastrophe. Egyptian historical records offer a different perspective on giant survival strategies. The Turin King list references giant god kings who ruled before the pharaohs and describes how some of these beings departed to the heavens when the Great Deluge came. While this could be metaphorical, other Egyptian texts describe advanced flying vehicles and technologies that might have enabled escape to elevated locations or even off-world survival. The pyramid texts include references to antediluvian giants who possessed knowledge of raising the sky and parting the waters, suggesting technological capabilities that could have provided protection during flooding events. Egyptian mythology describes how some giants transform themselves into various forms to survive catastrophic events, which might represent advanced genetic manipulation or shape-shifting technologies. Greek historical accounts provide additional documentation of giant survival methods. Hesiod's Theogony describes how some titans escaped Zeus's judgment by hiding in Tartarus, deep underground chambers beneath the Earth's surface. While often interpreted mythologically, these accounts might preserve historical memories of actual underground survival systems. Apollodorus documented traditions about giants who survived the Deucalion flood by retreating to high mountains and underground caverns. His accounts include specific geographical locations where giant remnants were said to have established new settlements after the waters receded. Archaeological investigations of some of these sites have revealed megalithic construction that supports rather than contradicts these historical claims. Native American historical traditions preserved by tribal elders describe giants who used several survival strategies during the Great Flooding. The Hopi tradition speaks of giants who retreated to the Third World underground during surface catastrophes. Detailed accounts describe vast cavern systems with underground rivers, artificial lighting, and agricultural areas that could sustain large populations indefinitely. The Cherokee preserve accounts of giants called Kituwa, who built extensive tunnel networks throughout the Appalachian Mountains. These tunnels allegedly connected to underground cities that served as refuges during the Great Flooding. Archaeological discoveries in Tennessee and Kentucky have revealed tunnel systems and megalithic chambers that align with these traditional accounts. Lakota traditions describe giants who possessed medicine that allowed them to breathe underwater for extended periods. While this might sound mythological, recent research into submarine medicine and underwater breathing apparatus suggests that advanced understanding of human physiology could potentially enable extended underwater survival that would seem impossible to ancient observers. Celtic historical accounts preserved in Irish annals describe the Fomorians, giant beings who survived the Great Deluge by using magical boats that could travel beneath the water's surface. The Lebor Gabala provides detailed descriptions of these vessels and their capabilities, which sound remarkably similar to modern submarine technology when stripped of mythological language. Scandinavian chronicles preserved in the prose. Edda describe how some Jotuns survived Ragnarok's flooding by hiding in Jormungandr's coils beneath the ocean. While mythological in presentation, these accounts might preserve memories of underwater survival chambers or submarine-like vessels that enabled prolonged underwater existence. Chinese historical records include accounts of giant rulers who survived the Great Deluge by using dragon boats that could travel beneath the surface and by retreating to the dragon palace under the sea. The Shanhai Jing describes technological capabilities that align remarkably well with modern underwater habitation and transportation systems. Hindu texts provide perhaps the most detailed accounts of giant survival strategies. The Puranas describe how the Daityas and Danavas used various methods to survive Pralaya, the cosmic deluge. Some retreated to Patala, underground realms with advanced technologies. Others used vimanas, flying vehicles, to escape to other worlds or elevated locations above flood levels. The Mahabharata includes specific technical details about underwater cities with artificial atmospheres, advanced recycling systems, and technologies that enabled long-term survival beneath the surface. These descriptions include engineering details that seem remarkably prescient when compared to modern underwater habitat research. The historical documentation reveals three primary survival strategies employed by giants across different cultures: underground refuge systems, underwater habitation, and escape to elevated or off-world locations. Each strategy required advanced knowledge and technologies that exceeded what mainstream history attributes to ancient civilizations, but which aligned perfectly with accounts of giant capabilities preserved in multiple cultural traditions. What makes this documentation particularly compelling is its consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other. The precision of technical details, the similarity of survival mechanisms, and the geographical specificity all suggest shared historical memory of actual events rather than independent mythological development. But the most disturbing aspect of this historical evidence isn't just that it validates giant survival through the flood, it's what these survival strategies reveal about the level of planning, technological capability, and coordinated effort that went into preserving these beings through divine judgment. This wasn't random survival. This was systematic preservation of bloodlines and knowledge that suggests a much larger agenda than simple self-preservation. The implications extend far beyond ancient history into questions about what these survival strategies mean for understanding modern genetic manipulation, underground installation construction, and technologies that might enable survival through future catastrophic events. Because if giants successfully preserved themselves through divine judgment once, the patterns they established might still be operational today. The cultural evidence surrounding giant survival reveals something even more unsettling than the historical accounts themselves. Because what we're looking at isn't just documentation of past events, but living traditions that have shaped entire civilizations, influenced architectural decisions, and guided technological development in ways that suggest these survival strategies didn't just preserve individual giants, but entire systems of knowledge and influence. Consider how deeply these traditions penetrated ancient Mesopotamian culture. The ziggurat complexes weren't just temples, but included extensive underground chambers, tunnel systems, and storage facilities that mirror the survival installations described in their flood narratives. The technical sophistication of these constructions suggests practical knowledge derived from actual experience rather than theoretical planning. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. The cultural significance of these underground systems extends beyond mere construction to include religious and social practices centered around preparation for catastrophic events. Mesopotamian rituals included ceremonies for blessing underground refugees, maintaining food stores, and preserving essential knowledge during times of divine judgment. These weren't symbolic activities. They were practical preparations based on cultural memory of actual survival experiences. Egyptian culture demonstrates perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of a giant survival through their elaborate underground tomb complexes and preservation technologies. The precision of Egyptian mummification, the complexity of underground pyramid chambers, and the advanced engineering of sites like the Serapeum of Saqqara all suggest cultural knowledge derived from ancient survival techniques that exceeded normal human capabilities. Think about this connection. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife closely parallels descriptions of underground giant cities found in other cultures. The detailed maps of the underworld, the sophisticated understanding of preservation techniques, and the complex engineering of underground chambers all suggest cultural memory of actual underground civilizations rather than purely spiritual concepts. Celtic culture preserved detailed knowledge of underground giant civilizations through their traditions about the Cedar, often mistranslated as fairies but actually describing giants who lived in underground palaces connected by tunnel systems. Irish cultural practices included elaborate underground constructions like Newgrange and other megalithic sites that demonstrate practical application of underground survival techniques. The Celtic emphasis on maintaining connections to the other world reflects cultural memory of communication with underground giant populations that survived catastrophic events. The sophisticated understanding of underground acoustics, ventilation, and preservation techniques embedded in Celtic cultural practices suggests knowledge derived from actual contact with underground civilizations. Native American cultural evidence provides the most comprehensive documentation of giant survival traditions. Over 200 tribes across North America preserve detailed accounts of underground giant cities, specific tunnel entrances, and ongoing contact with giant populations that survived the Great Flooding. These cultural memories include practical knowledge about underground navigation, survival techniques, and communication methods. The Hopi cultural practice of building underground ceremonial chambers, kivas, directly reflects their traditions about the underground third world, where giants took refuge during surface catastrophes. The technical specifications of Kiva construction, including ventilation systems and acoustic properties, mirror descriptions of ancient giant survival installations. Cherokee cultural knowledge includes detailed maps of underground tunnel systems throughout the Appalachian Mountains, passed down through generations of tribal keepers. These cultural maps have guided modern archaeological investigations that have discovered actual tunnel systems and megalithic chambers in locations precisely matching traditional accounts. Asian cultural evidence reveals sophisticated understanding of underground and underwater giant survival systems. Chinese culture developed elaborate underground construction techniques and underwater breathing methods that reflect their traditions about giant survival during the Great Deluge. The technical knowledge preserved in Chinese cultural practices suggests practical application rather than theoretical understanding. Hindu culture preserves the most detailed technical knowledge about giant survival technologies through texts like the Vimanika Shastra, which describes aircraft construction, underwater habitats, and advanced preservation techniques attributed to giant beings who survived various catastrophic periods. The precision of these technical descriptions suggests cultural preservation of actual technological knowledge rather than imaginative speculation. European medieval culture incorporated giant survival traditions into their understanding of underground systems and preservation techniques. The construction of elaborate underground monasteries, the development of sophisticated food preservation methods, and the maintenance of underground libraries all reflect cultural knowledge derived from giant survival traditions. The medieval emphasis on maintaining underground scriptoriums and preservation facilities demonstrates practical application of knowledge about surviving catastrophic events that cultural traditions attributed to giant wisdom. The technical sophistication of these installations suggests influence from ancient survival techniques rather than independent medieval innovation. But what's most striking about this cultural evidence is how it reveals ongoing suppression of giant survival traditions by dominant religious and political institutions throughout history. The systematic elimination of indigenous traditions, the suppression of underground exploration, and the academic dismissal of cultural accounts all suggest institutional recognition of these traditions' historical validity, combined with deliberate efforts to prevent public awareness. Contemporary cultural movements attempting to preserve and investigate giant survival traditions face continued institutional resistance, despite growing archaeological evidence that validates traditional accounts. The persistence of this resistance suggests ongoing recognition that these cultural traditions contain historically accurate information about events and populations that challenge established historical narratives. The cultural evidence demonstrates that giant survival through flood events isn't peripheral mythology, but foundational knowledge that has shaped human civilization's understanding of catastrophic survival, underground construction, and the persistence of ancient bloodlines through divine judgment. The practical knowledge embedded in these cultural traditions suggests actual historical experience with giant survival techniques rather than imaginative storytelling. The sophistication of preservation techniques, the consistency of survival strategies across cultures, and the ongoing practical application of ancient survival knowledge all point toward cultural memory of actual giant survival rather than mythological development. These cultural traditions provide crucial context for understanding how giants could have survived flood events and influenced post-flood human civilization. Modern evidence for giant survival continues to emerge through contemporary discoveries that validate ancient accounts while revealing ongoing giant presence in our current world. Archaeological investigations, genetic research, and documented sightings all point towards successful giant survival strategies that enabled these beings to persist through catastrophic events and maintain hidden populations into modern times. Recent archaeological discoveries provide compelling physical evidence for sophisticated giant survival installations. The Longyu Caves in China, discovered in 1992, represent one of the largest underground excavations in history, with precision-cut chambers that could house thousands of individuals. The acoustic properties, ventilation systems, and preservation capabilities of these installations match descriptions of giant survival facilities found in ancient texts. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in Egypt have revealed extensive underground tunnel networks beneath the Giza Plateau that connect to large chamber systems capable of sustaining significant populations. The technical sophistication of these installations exceeds what mainstream archaeology attributes to ancient Egyptian capabilities, suggesting construction by beings with advanced engineering knowledge. Underwater archaeological discoveries off the coast of Japan, India, and the Mediterranean provide evidence for submerged giant installations that could have served as underwater survival colonies during flood events. The Yonaguni Monument off Japan displays precision cutting and geometric patterns that suggest artificial construction by beings with capabilities exceeding those attributed to ancient humans. Genetic research increasingly supports the reality of non-human genetic contribution to human populations that could explain post-flood giant reappearance. Research into anomalous skull specimens has revealed genetic sequences that don't match known human haplogroups, suggesting hybridization with unknown species. While controversial, this research aligns with ancient accounts of genetic mixing between humans and non-human entities. Contemporary DNA analysis of elongated skulls from Peru, conducted by independent laboratories, has identified genetic markers that exceed the normal range of human genetic diversity. These expeditions have documented cranial volumes up to 30% larger than normal human skulls, with bone density and structural features that suggest different evolutionary development than standard human populations. Modern sightings of giant beings in remote locations worldwide provide contemporary evidence for ongoing giant populations that survived ancient catastrophes. The Sasquatch phenomenon in North America, documented by researchers, describes beings with characteristics matching ancient giant descriptions: enormous size, intelligence, and capabilities exceeding normal human limitations. Government documentation of giant encounters includes classified military reports of contact with beings of extraordinary size in underground installations and remote wilderness areas. While most of these reports remain classified, leaked documents and whistleblower testimonies describe ongoing awareness of giant populations among intelligence agencies and military organizations. Underground exploration teams continue to discover evidence for active giant habitation in cave systems and underground installations worldwide. The exploration work conducted by various research organizations has documented tunnel systems with passages sized for beings much larger than normal humans, along with artifacts and construction techniques that suggest ongoing occupation. Thermal imaging and acoustic detection technologies have identified underground population centers in regions traditionally associated with giant legends. These technical surveys reveal heat signatures and acoustic patterns consistent with large underground communities in areas where surface populations report ongoing giant encounters. The preservation of giant genetic material through advanced survival techniques explains how giant traits could reappear in post-flood populations without requiring direct giant survival. If pre-flood giants possess knowledge of genetic preservation, cryogenic techniques, or other advanced biotechnologies, they could have preserved genetic material for later reconstitution, even if original populations didn't survive directly. Contemporary genetic engineering capabilities provide frameworks for understanding how ancient giants might have preserved and later restored their bloodlines. Modern cryogenic preservation, genetic storage techniques, and biotechnology applications all demonstrate that biological material can be preserved through catastrophic events and later used to restore populations with desired characteristics. Space archaeology, using satellite imagery, has identified artificial structures in remote locations that match descriptions of giant installations found in ancient texts. These discoveries include megalithic construction in desert and mountain regions that demonstrate engineering capabilities exceeding those typically attributed to ancient human civilizations. The systematic suppression of modern giant evidence follows patterns established in earlier historical periods, suggesting ongoing institutional awareness of giant survival combined with deliberate efforts to prevent public recognition. Archaeological sites containing giant evidence face restricted access, funding limitations, and academic dismissal that appears disproportionate to their potential historical significance. Digital technology applications, including social media platforms and independent research networks, have democratized information sharing about giant discoveries, making systematic suppression more difficult than in previous historical periods. Contemporary researchers have documented extensive evidence for ongoing giant presence through photographic documentation, witness interviews, and archaeological investigation. Corporate involvement in archaeological suppression has become more sophisticated, with technology companies, media corporations, and academic institutions coordinating efforts to limit public access to giant evidence. Search engine algorithms, social media content restrictions, and academic publication policies all demonstrate systematic bias against information that validates giant survival and ongoing presence. The military applications of giant research suggest government awareness of giant survival and ongoing research into giant capabilities for potential military advantage. Black budget projects reportedly include investigation of giant strength, longevity, and intelligence characteristics for possible application in human enhancement programs. Environmental monitoring data from remote regions indicates ongoing large-scale activity in areas traditionally associated with giant populations. Seismic patterns, electromagnetic anomalies, and unexplained infrastructure development in isolated locations suggest active giant communities with technological capabilities that exceed those acknowledged by mainstream science. The biotechnology implications of giant survival include potential access to genetic enhancement techniques that could explain their persistence through catastrophic events. If giants possess knowledge of genetic manipulation, life extension, and adaptation technologies, they could have modified themselves for survival in post-flood environmental conditions. Witness testimony from indigenous populations worldwide describes ongoing contact with giant beings in remote locations, often in the context of territorial agreements or resource-sharing arrangements. These contemporary accounts include specific details about giant capabilities, social structures, and technologies that align with ancient descriptions while suggesting continued evolution and advancement. The space program connections include reports of giant skeletal remains discovered during lunar and Mars exploration missions, suggesting that giant populations may have achieved off-world colonies that enabled survival through terrestrial catastrophes. While these reports remain unconfirmed, they align with ancient accounts of giant technological capabilities and escape strategies. Modern medical anomalies, including individuals with extraordinary size, strength, and longevity characteristics, might represent manifestations of latent giant genetics preserved through flood survival mechanisms. These cases often involve genetic markers that don't fit standard human patterns, suggesting activation of ancient genetic sequences under specific environmental conditions. This modern evidence demonstrates that giant survival through the flood wasn't simply ancient history, but established patterns that continue to operate in contemporary contexts. The sophistication of survival strategies, the ongoing evidence for giant presence, and the systematic efforts to suppress this information all suggest that understanding giant survival during the flood provides crucial context for interpreting current unexplained phenomena and archaeological discoveries. But as compelling as this evidence is, we need to address the legitimate questions and counter-arguments that skeptics raise. Because understanding the objections to giant survival theories actually strengthens our position by demonstrating that this evidence can withstand the most rigorous intellectual scrutiny. The skepticism reveals more about institutional bias than about the quality of evidence itself. The most common objection raised by skeptics is what scholars call the complete destruction argument. Critics insist that biblical language about the flood destroying all flesh eliminates any possibility of giant survival. They point to Genesis 7:21-23, which explicitly states that everything with breath died except what was preserved in the ark, making giant survival impossible regardless of their technologies or strategies. But this objection oversimplifies Hebrew terminology while ignoring contextual evidence for regional rather than universal destruction. The Hebrew word kol, translated as all, frequently means all within a specific region rather than all in the entire world. Genesis 41:57 uses identical language to describe famine affecting all the earth, yet clearly refers to regional rather than global catastrophe. The flood's universality might describe complete destruction within specific regions of human habitation, rather than literally covering every square inch of the planet. This interpretation gains credibility when you examine flood geology. The Hebrew term eretz can mean either earth or land, depending on context. If the flood targeted regions where genetic corruption had reached critical levels while leaving other areas unaffected, giant populations in distant locations could survive while the flood accomplished its primary goal of genetic purification in contaminated regions. The second major objection involves genetic impossibility. Skeptics argue that giant survival through genetic preservation would require technologies that ancient civilizations couldn't possibly possess. They claim that cryogenic preservation, genetic storage, and biotechnology applications require modern scientific knowledge unavailable to pre-flood populations, making genetic preservation theories scientifically impossible. This objection assumes that pre-flood civilizations possessed only primitive technologies rather than advanced capabilities that ancient texts consistently describe. If giants were hybrid beings produced through interaction with non-human entities possessing advanced knowledge, they could have had access to preservation technologies that exceed even current human capabilities. The objection ignores evidence for advanced ancient technologies found in archaeological contexts that mainstream science cannot adequately explain. Consider the precision of ancient megalithic construction, the sophistication of astronomical calculations embedded in ancient monuments, and the mathematical constants encoded in structures like the Great Pyramid. These achievements suggest technological capabilities that conventional archaeology refuses to acknowledge, providing frameworks for understanding how genetic preservation might have been possible. The mythological interpretation objection suggests that giant accounts represent symbolic or allegorical content rather than historical documentation. Critics argue that flood narratives from various cultures developed independently as natural disaster metaphors, psychological archetypes, or religious symbolism, rather than preserving memories of actual giant populations and survival events. However, this objection cannot account for the specific technical details and geographic consistency found across cultures that had no contact with each other. Mythological development typically shows variation and cultural adaptation, while giant survival accounts maintain remarkable consistency in survival strategies, technologies, and geographical details. The precision of engineering specifications, the accuracy of geographical descriptions, and the consistency of genetic information all suggest historical memory rather than symbolic development. When independent cultures describe identical underground ventilation systems, similar underwater breathing techniques, and matching genetic preservation methods, we're looking at shared historical experience rather than coincidental mythology. The archaeological absence objection claims that systematic archaeological investigation should have uncovered definitive evidence for giant populations if they survived in significant numbers. Critics point out that mainstream archaeology has not validated claims about giant skeletal remains, underground installations, or advanced ancient technologies, suggesting that such evidence doesn't actually exist. But this objection ignores documented evidence for systematic suppression of archaeological discoveries that contradict established historical narratives. The Smithsonian controversy, academic dismissal of anomalous finds, and restricted access to potentially significant sites all suggest that absence of evidence reflects institutional suppression rather than actual absence. The objection overlooks the vast areas of Earth that remain archaeologically unexplored, particularly underground and underwater regions, where giant survival installations would most likely be located. Recent discoveries of massive underground complexes in Turkey, China, and other locations demonstrate that enormous ancient installations can remain hidden for millennia before accidental discovery. The scale impossibility objection argues that underground installations capable of sustaining giant populations through multi-year catastrophic events would require construction projects so massive they couldn't be completed or concealed from historical documentation. Critics suggest that engineering requirements for such installations would exceed ancient construction capabilities, while leaving archaeological evidence that should be easily discoverable. This objection underestimates both ancient construction capabilities and concealment possibilities of underground installations. Existing discoveries like Derinkuyu in Turkey demonstrate that ancient civilizations could construct massive underground complexes capable of housing thousands of people. The objection assumes that giant installations would be concentrated in currently inhabited regions rather than distributed across remote locations that remain largely unexplored. Modern examples of massive underground construction projects that remain secret for decades provide contemporary parallels for understanding how ancient installations could be concealed. Military bunker systems, underground cities, and subterranean industrial facilities all demonstrate that enormous construction projects can remain hidden through careful planning and geographic isolation. The population genetics objection claims that post-flood giant reappearance would require population numbers and genetic diversity that couldn't be maintained through any plausible survival scenario. Critics argue that small surviving populations would face genetic bottlenecks that would prevent sustainable reproduction, making long-term giant survival demographically impossible. But this objection ignores the enhanced longevity and reproductive capabilities that ancient texts attribute to giant populations. If giants possessed lifespans measured in thousands of years and enhanced reproductive capacity, small surviving populations could maintain genetic diversity and population growth that would be impossible for normal human populations. The objection also overlooks possibilities for genetic restoration through preserved biological material or continued interaction with non-human entities. If giants maintained contact with supernatural sources of genetic information, they could supplement natural reproduction with technological enhancement that prevented genetic bottlenecks. The theological contradiction objection argues that giant survival would undermine divine justice and the flood's effectiveness as judgment against corruption. Critics suggest that if God intended to eliminate genetic corruption through flood judgment, successful giant survival would represent divine failure or limited divine power, creating theological problems for biblical authority. However, this objection misunderstands the relationship between divine sovereignty and created beings' free will in biblical theology. Divine judgment serves ultimate redemptive purposes rather than merely punitive goals. Giant survival through the flood could serve divine purposes by demonstrating the persistence of corruption while setting up conditions for ultimate resolution through Christ's redemptive work. The objection assumes that divine judgment must achieve immediate total elimination rather than working through historical processes that serve larger spiritual goals. Biblical precedent shows that God often allows rebellious beings to persist temporarily while accomplishing long-term purposes that exceed immediate judgment objectives. The scientific materialism objection dismisses giant accounts as supernatural claims that lack empirical validation and contradict scientific understanding of human evolution, archaeological evidence, and genetic possibilities. Critics argue that accepting giant survival requires abandoning scientific methodology in favor of religious belief that contradicts established knowledge. But this objection assumes philosophical materialism rather than demonstrating it, while ignoring scientific evidence that supports rather than contradicts giant theories. Genetic research revealing non-human DNA in human populations, archaeological discoveries of anomalous ancient technologies, and documented cases of human genetic abnormalities all provide scientific frameworks for understanding giant survival possibilities. The objection confuses methodological naturalism, useful for scientific investigation, with philosophical naturalism, an unnecessary metaphysical assumption. Science can acknowledge supernatural possibilities while maintaining rigorous investigative standards, just as it acknowledges quantum mechanics and other phenomena that exceed normal physical expectations. After examining these counter-arguments carefully, the evidence for giant survival through flood events remains compelling. The objections raise legitimate concerns that deserve consideration, but they fail to eliminate the comprehensive case that emerges from multiple independent lines of evidence. Many objections reveal more about the philosophical assumptions and institutional biases of critics than about the quality of evidence they're attempting to refute. The most sophisticated objections acknowledge the evidence while proposing alternative explanations that attempt to preserve materialistic assumptions, suggesting recognition of the evidence's strength while disagreeing about its interpretation. What emerges from this analysis isn't just validation of giant survival theories, but insight into how institutional suppression operates through academic, religious, and scientific establishments that have vested interests in maintaining current paradigms. Understanding these suppression mechanisms becomes crucial for recognizing how evidence gets filtered, dismissed, or reinterpreted to support predetermined conclusions. The resistance patterns themselves validate the significance of giant survival evidence by demonstrating coordinated efforts to suppress, discredit, or misdirect attention from information that would validate giant survival and ongoing presence. The sophistication of suppression efforts indicates recognition of the evidence's importance by authorities who benefit from maintaining current historical and spiritual paradigms. But understanding the objections and suppression mechanisms leads us to an even more important question. If giants did survive divine judgment through sophisticated strategies, and if evidence for their ongoing presence continues to emerge despite systematic suppression, what does this mean for our understanding of current events and future possibilities? The implications extend far beyond academic debate into practical questions about spiritual warfare, technological development, and preparation for conditions that ancient texts suggest will return in the last days. Because if the patterns we've uncovered are accurate, then understanding giant survival isn't just historical curiosity, it's preparation for what may be coming next. The solution framework that emerges from this evidence reveals a comprehensive system of preservation strategies that operated according to advanced knowledge, sophisticated technologies, and long-term planning that enabled these beings to persist through divine judgment while maintaining their influence on post-flood human civilization. This framework transforms our understanding of both ancient history and contemporary unexplained phenomena. The foundational principle recognizes that the flood served specific rather than universal purposes. Instead of eliminating all life globally, divine judgment targeted regions where genetic corruption had reached critical levels while preserving pure human genetics through Noah's family. This selective approach allowed giant populations in unaffected regions or protected locations to survive while accomplishing the flood's primary goal of genetic purification. The multi-strategy survival system employed by giants demonstrates sophisticated understanding of catastrophic survival that exceeded normal human capabilities. Giants didn't rely on single survival methods, but implemented comprehensive approaches that included underground refuge systems, underwater habitation, genetic preservation technologies, and geographic escape to unaffected regions. This redundancy ensured survival even if individual strategies failed. The technological framework that enabled these survival strategies becomes plausible when we acknowledge that giants possessed knowledge derived from non-human sources. Advanced preservation technologies, cryogenic storage, sophisticated construction techniques, and underwater breathing systems all become reasonable when viewed through frameworks that acknowledge non-human technological contribution. The temporal dimension reveals that giant survival operated according to long-term planning that spanned centuries or millennia before flood events. Ancient texts describe construction projects that required generations to complete, suggesting foreknowledge of coming catastrophe combined with systematic preparation. This temporal framework indicates that giant survival wasn't reactive emergency response, but proactive systematic preparation. The geographical distribution framework explains how giants could survive regional flooding while appearing to be completely eliminated from biblical narratives. If flood judgment concentrated on specific regions where genetic corruption threatened human genetic integrity, giant populations in distant locations could remain unaffected, while seeming to disappear from Middle Eastern historical records. The genetic preservation mechanism provides the most scientifically plausible explanation for post-flood giant reappearance. If giants possessed advanced biotechnology capabilities, they could have preserved genetic material for later reconstruction, even if original populations didn't survive directly. Modern, cryogenic, and genetic storage technologies demonstrate that biological material can be preserved indefinitely for later use. But the framework also addresses the spiritual warfare dimension that operated behind physical survival strategies. Giant survival wasn't merely technological achievement, but spiritual rebellion against divine judgment that required supernatural assistance from entities opposed to divine purposes. Understanding this spiritual dimension helps explain both the sophistication of survival strategies and their ultimate failure to prevent divine victory. The institutional preservation component reveals how giant knowledge and influence persisted through post-flood human institutions, even when direct giant presence remained hidden. Secret societies, mystery schools, and religious systems all served as vehicles for preserving and transmitting giant knowledge while concealing its true sources from general populations. The cultural integration mechanism shows how surviving giants influenced post-flood human development through teaching, technological transfer, and genetic mixing that didn't require direct conquest or obvious domination. By presenting themselves as beneficial teachers or divine messengers, surviving giants could shape human civilization while avoiding direct confrontation with divine authority. The concealment strategy demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how to maintain hidden presence while avoiding detection by populations loyal to divine authority. Underground installations, remote geographical locations, and carefully managed surface contact all enable giant populations to persist while remaining largely invisible to mainstream human civilization. The framework explains the cyclical pattern of giant manifestation throughout human history, where these beings appear during periods of moral decline and technological advancement, only to disappear again during periods of divine intervention or spiritual renewal. This pattern suggests ongoing presence rather than periodic creation, with visibility depending on spiritual and technological conditions rather than actual population levels. The modern application reveals how ancient giant survival strategies continue to operate through contemporary technologies and institutions. Underground installations, genetic preservation, technological concealment, and institutional influence all persist in modern forms that enable ongoing giant presence while avoiding mainstream recognition. The prophetic dimension connects giant survival through the flood to biblical predictions about end times conditions that will resemble the days of Noah. If giants successfully preserved their populations and influence through divine judgment, their return to prominence in end-time scenarios becomes continuation of ancient survival strategies rather than entirely new supernatural intervention. But here's where this framework becomes personally relevant for every person watching this video. The research methodology provides guidelines for investigating giant survival evidence while avoiding both naive credulity and systematic suppression. This methodology acknowledges that giant research requires interdisciplinary approaches that include archaeology, genetics, ancient history, and spiritual discernment, rather than limiting investigation to single academic disciplines. The verification criteria help distinguish between legitimate giant evidence and hoaxes, misidentifications, or cultural projections. Authentic giant evidence typically demonstrates technological sophistication, genetic anomalies, cultural consistency, and spiritual dimensions that casual fabrication cannot replicate convincingly. The educational implications require revision of historical and archaeological curricula to acknowledge possibilities that mainstream academia systematically excludes. Understanding giant survival provides frameworks for interpreting anomalous archaeological discoveries, unexplained ancient technologies, and cultural traditions that don't fit established historical paradigms. The practical applications extend to contemporary security, archaeological investigation, and spiritual warfare preparation. If giant populations continue to exist in hidden locations with advanced capabilities, understanding their presence becomes relevant for national security, archaeological protection, and spiritual discernment in modern contexts. The solution framework reveals that giant survival through the flood wasn't mere historical curiosity, but established patterns that continue to operate in contemporary contexts. Understanding these patterns provides insight into unexplained archaeological discoveries, ongoing unexplained phenomena, and the spiritual warfare that shapes human civilization behind visible historical events. The hope dimension emerges from understanding that giant survival operates within, rather than outside, divine sovereignty. Even successful survival strategies ultimately serve divine purposes by demonstrating the persistence of corruption, while setting up conditions for ultimate resolution through Christ's redemptive work that addresses both human sin and genetic corruption. The framework provides practical wisdom for contemporary believers by revealing how ancient spiritual warfare patterns continue to operate through modern forms. Understanding giant survival helps interpret current events, archaeological discoveries, and technological developments through spiritual discernment rather than purely secular analysis. The ultimate significance of this framework extends beyond mere historical revision to fundamental questions about human origins, spiritual warfare, and cosmic conflict that affects every aspect of human existence. Giant survival through the flood demonstrates that spiritual rebellion can persist through divine judgment, while ultimately serving divine purposes for human redemption and cosmic restoration. The operational mechanisms through which giants survived the flood reveal sophisticated strategies that continue to influence human civilization through methods that appear natural or technological while serving supernatural agendas. Understanding these mechanisms provides practical wisdom for recognizing spiritual warfare that operates through apparently secular institutions and cultural developments. The underground survival mechanism operated through massive subterranean installations that provided long-term habitation during surface catastrophes. These installations required advanced engineering knowledge that exceeded normal human capabilities, including sophisticated ventilation systems, water management, food preservation, and waste disposal technologies. Think about the scale and sophistication required for underground cities capable of sustaining giant populations through multi-year catastrophic events. The installations needed artificial lighting systems, air circulation networks, communication technologies, and manufacturing capabilities that enabled self-sufficiency during extended isolation periods. Archaeological discoveries of underground complexes worldwide validate the feasibility of such installations, while suggesting they were constructed by beings with advanced technical knowledge. The genetic preservation mechanism involved sophisticated biotechnology that enabled storage and later reconstruction of biological material. Ancient texts describe preservation techniques that sound remarkably similar to modern cryogenic storage, genetic banking, and biotechnology applications. If giants possessed knowledge derived from non-human sources, they could have developed preservation methods that exceed current human technological capabilities. This mechanism explains post-flood giant reappearance without requiring direct survival of large populations. Preserved genetic material could be used to reconstruct giant bloodlines, generations or centuries after flood events, accounting for the time gaps between flood narratives and subsequent giant appearances in biblical and historical accounts. The technological concealment mechanism enabled giants to maintain advanced capabilities while avoiding detection by post-flood human populations. This involved developing technologies that appeared magical or supernatural to observers with limited technical understanding, creating the foundation for mythology and religious traditions that preserved memories while obscuring their technological basis. Modern examples include technologies that exceed public knowledge while remaining concealed through classification, corporate secrecy, or institutional suppression. The mechanism demonstrates how advanced capabilities can be maintained without general recognition, providing frameworks for understanding how giants could preserve technological advantages through historical periods. The institutional infiltration mechanism operated through establishing influence within human, religious, educational, and governmental systems without requiring direct giant control. By presenting themselves as beneficial teachers, divine messengers, or wise counselors, surviving giants could shape human development while remaining largely invisible to populations that might resist obvious giant domination. This mechanism continues to operate through secret societies, mystery schools, and institutional hierarchies that preserve and transmit knowledge while concealing its true sources. Understanding this mechanism helps explain how ancient giant influence persists through modern institutions that promote ideologies and practices contrary to biblical values. The bloodline preservation mechanism involved strategic intermarriage with human populations to maintain giant genetics while avoiding detection through obvious physical manifestations. Recessive giant genes could remain dormant for generations before manifesting under specific environmental or spiritual conditions, enabling genetic preservation through seemingly normal human lineages. Contemporary genetic research reveals that human populations carry DNA from unknown sources that could represent remnants of ancient hybridization events. Understanding this mechanism provides frameworks for interpreting genetic anomalies, unexplained human capabilities, and the persistent appearance of individuals with characteristics that exceed normal human parameters. The geographical dispersal mechanism enabled giant populations to survive regional catastrophes by maintaining populations in unaffected areas that could later recolonize devastated regions. This required global communication networks, transportation capabilities, and coordination systems that enabled rapid response to catastrophic events. Ancient accounts of global travel, advanced navigation, and international communication suggest that pre-flood civilizations possessed capabilities that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. Understanding this mechanism helps explain how giant influence could reappear rapidly in post-flood civilizations, despite apparent complete elimination. The spiritual warfare mechanism operated through alliance with supernatural entities opposed to divine authority. Giant survival wasn't merely technological achievement, but spiritual rebellion that required supernatural assistance for success. This mechanism continues to operate through spiritual influences that shape human institutions, cultural developments, and individual choices in directions that serve rebellious rather than divine purposes. Understanding this mechanism provides insight into how spiritual warfare operates through apparently secular institutions and cultural movements. The same spiritual forces that enabled giant survival continue to influence human civilization through mechanisms that appear natural or technological while serving supernatural agendas. The information control mechanism involves systematically suppressing or distorting evidence that would validate giant survival, while promoting narratives that obscure their continued presence. This required controlling educational curricula, historical documentation, and archaeological interpretation to prevent public awareness of evidence that could expose giant survival and ongoing influence. Modern information control operates through media ownership, academic funding, search engine algorithms, and social media content restrictions that limit public access to information, challenging established narratives. Understanding this mechanism helps explain why evidence for giant survival remains marginalized despite its abundance and quality. The cultural conditioning mechanism shaped human beliefs and expectations to make giant presence seem impossible or irrelevant, while promoting worldviews that facilitate giant goals without recognition. This involved establishing philosophical frameworks, scientific paradigms, and religious interpretations that deny supernatural reality while enabling spiritual manipulation through apparently natural processes. Contemporary cultural conditioning operates through entertainment, education, and media that promote materialistic worldviews while suppressing spiritual discernment. Understanding this mechanism helps recognize how ancient patterns continue to operate through modern forms that achieve similar goals through different methods. The technological advancement mechanism involved selectively sharing advanced knowledge with human populations to accelerate technological development while maintaining superior capabilities that enable continued dominance. This creates the appearance of human achievement while actually representing guided development that serves giant strategic purposes. Modern technological development in areas like artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and consciousness manipulation may represent continuation of this mechanism through corporate, academic, and governmental institutions that receive guidance from sources they don't fully understand or acknowledge. The crisis exploitation mechanism involves using natural disasters, social upheavals, and economic disruptions to implement changes that would be resisted under normal circumstances. Giant survival required creating conditions that enabled their persistence while appearing to respond to natural developments rather than engineered manipulation. Contemporary crisis exploitation operates through manufactured emergencies, social engineering, and problem reaction solution strategies that implement desired changes while appearing to address legitimate concerns. Understanding this mechanism helps recognize when crises serve hidden agendas rather than addressing genuine problems. The revelation control mechanism manages the timing and extent of information disclosure to prevent complete exposure while maintaining sufficient mystery to discredit serious investigation. This involves strategic leaks, partial revelations, and controlled opposition that acknowledges some truth while misdirecting attention from core realities. Modern revelation control operates through limited disclosure programs, conspiracy culture, and alternative media that provide partial truth while preventing comprehensive understanding. The mechanism maintains public confusion while advancing agendas that require partial awareness combined with systematic misdirection. These operational mechanisms reveal that giant survival, through the flood, established patterns that continue to influence human civilization through methods that appear natural or technological while serving supernatural agendas. Understanding these mechanisms provides practical wisdom for recognizing spiritual warfare that operates through apparently secular institutions and cultural developments. The sophistication of these mechanisms demonstrates that giant survival required comprehensive strategy that integrated technological, spiritual, cultural, and institutional elements into a unified approach that could persist through changing historical circumstances while maintaining core objectives. Modern manifestations of these mechanisms suggest that ancient patterns continue to operate through contemporary forms. But understanding how these mechanisms operate leads us to the most important question of all. If these patterns are still active, If giant influence continues to shape human civilization through hidden mechanisms, and if ancient texts predict the return of conditions similar to Noah's day, what does this mean for our immediate future? The convergence of all this evidence points towards something that most people aren't prepared to consider. We may be living in the time that ancient prophets warned about, when the same forces that corrupted the pre-flood world would return with even greater sophistication and technological capability. The signs are all around us if we know how to recognize them. Genetic manipulation that exceeds anything achieved in recorded history. Underground installations being constructed on unprecedented scales. Technological developments that seem to advance beyond human capability. Cultural conditioning that promotes worldviews contrary to biblical truth while suppressing spiritual discernment. But here's what gives me hope in the midst of these disturbing revelations. The same God who preserved Noah's family through the flood, who fought for Israel against the giants, who established his kingdom through Christ's victory over spiritual powers, is still sovereign over all these forces. Giant survival through the flood doesn't represent divine defeat, but divine patience that allows rebellion to reach its full development before final judgment. Understanding these patterns isn't meant to create fear, but to provide wisdom for recognizing the times we're living in and positioning ourselves correctly for what may be coming. Just as Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord and was preserved through judgment, those who understand these realities and remain faithful to divine truth will be protected and preserved. The story of Noah's Ark reveals that divine preservation operates alongside divine judgment. The same flood that destroyed the corrupt world lifted the ark to safety. The same principles that operated then continue to operate now, providing hope for those who recognize the signs and prepare accordingly. This isn't about predicting specific dates or times, but about understanding patterns that help us interpret current events through spiritual rather than merely secular frameworks. When we see genetic manipulation advancing at unprecedented rates, when underground construction projects expand globally, when cultural conditioning promotes ideas contrary to biblical truth, we're witnessing the continuation of ancient patterns rather than entirely new developments. The ultimate message isn't one of doom, but of divine faithfulness that transcends any opposition created beings can mount. Giant survival through the flood demonstrates both the sophistication of rebellion against divine authority and the certainty of divine victory over all such opposition. But this understanding comes with responsibility. Those who recognize these patterns have an obligation to share this knowledge with others who may benefit from enhanced spiritual discernment and historical understanding. The evidence provides compelling validation for biblical authority while addressing contemporary mysteries that secular worldviews cannot adequately explain. The integration of all this evidence reveals that we're not just studying ancient history, but examining foundational patterns that continue to shape our world in ways most people never recognize. Understanding giant survival provides interpretive frameworks that resolve historical mysteries, while strengthening rather than weakening biblical authority and supernatural worldview. This knowledge transforms how we view spiritual warfare, archaeological discoveries, technological developments, and cultural trends. It provides practical wisdom for making decisions about education, career, relationships, and preparation for potentially challenging times ahead. But most importantly, it reminds us that the cosmic conflict between good and evil, between divine authority and rebellious opposition, continues to unfold through human history in ways that serve ultimate divine purposes, while providing opportunities for individual choice and spiritual development. The story of Noah's Ark isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing patterns that continue to operate, understanding the spiritual warfare that shapes human civilization, and positioning ourselves correctly for whatever challenges may lie ahead. Because if these patterns are accurate, we may be approaching times that will test human faith and spiritual discernment in ways not seen since the days of Noah himself. The question isn't whether these patterns will continue to unfold. The question is whether we'll recognize them, understand their significance, and position ourselves among those who remain faithful regardless of external circumstances. The same divine faithfulness that preserved Noah continues to operate today, providing hope and protection for those who trust in divine rather than human solutions to the challenges we face. The prophetic implications of understanding giant survival extend far beyond academic curiosity into urgent warnings about our current moment in history. Because when Jesus referenced the days of Noah in Matthew 24:37, he wasn't just talking about general wickedness or divine judgment. He was pointing to specific conditions that would characterize the end times, conditions that included the very genetic corruption and supernatural interference that motivated the flood in the first place. Think about what makes our current era unprecedented in human history. We're witnessing genetic manipulation on scales never before achieved. Scientists are creating human-animal hybrids, editing the human genome with CRISPR technology, and pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human. We're seeing the development of artificial intelligence systems that exceed human cognitive capabilities. We're observing underground construction projects of enormous scope and sophistication. But here's what most people miss. These aren't random technological developments. They're the modern manifestation of the same spiritual forces that operated before the flood, using contemporary tools to achieve ancient objectives. The goal remains identical: to corrupt human genetics, to merge human and non-human capabilities, and to create beings that transcend the limitations God placed on human nature. Consider the remarkable parallels between pre-flood conditions and our current technological trajectory. Ancient texts describe the Nephilim as possessing extraordinary size, supernatural abilities, and lifespans measured in thousands of years. Today's transhumanist movement promises to achieve these same enhancements through genetic engineering, cybernetic implants, and life extension technologies. The pre-flood world witnessed the corruption of human genetics through supernatural intervention. Our world is experiencing genetic modification through scientific advancement. The methods differ, but the underlying spiritual agenda remains constant. Both represent attempts to transform humanity beyond God's original design, to create beings that blur the line between human and something else entirely. The underground installations that enabled giant survival through the flood find their modern counterpart in the massive subterranean construction projects being undertaken globally, from the extensive tunnel networks beneath major cities to the deep underground military bases documented by government sources. We're witnessing preparation for catastrophic events on scales that echo ancient survival strategies. But the most disturbing parallel involves the institutional infiltration that enabled giant influence to persist through post-flood civilizations. Today's educational systems, media corporations, and governmental agencies demonstrate systematic bias toward ideologies that promote genetic manipulation, consciousness alteration, and human enhancement technologies, while systematically suppressing information that would enable spiritual discernment. The same mechanisms that preserved giant knowledge and influence through ancient institutions continue to operate through modern organizations that appear legitimate while serving agendas that contradict biblical values. Secret societies, academic institutions, and corporate hierarchies all function as vehicles for preserving and transmitting knowledge while concealing its true sources from general populations. This isn't conspiracy theory speculation. This is pattern recognition based on documented historical precedent and observable contemporary developments. The spiritual forces that enabled giant survival through divine judgment continue to operate through different methods but with identical objectives. The genetic preservation technologies that enabled post-flood giant reappearance find their modern expression in cryogenic storage facilities, genetic banking systems, and biotechnology applications that exceed public knowledge. Contemporary capabilities for preserving and manipulating biological material provide frameworks for understanding how ancient preservation strategies could have operated. The technological concealment that enabled giants to maintain advanced capabilities while avoiding detection by primitive populations finds its parallel in classified technologies that exceed publicly acknowledged capabilities. Black budget projects, corporate research divisions, and academic institutions all develop capabilities that remain hidden from general awareness while serving agendas that most people never recognize. The bloodline preservation that enabled giant genetics to persist through seemingly normal human populations finds its contemporary expression in genetic research that reveals non-human DNA sequences in human populations worldwide. These genetic anomalies suggest ongoing hybridization processes that operate through mechanisms most people don't understand. The geographical dispersal that enabled giant populations to survive regional catastrophes while maintaining global influence finds its modern counterpart in international networks of underground installations, advanced transportation systems, and communication technologies that enable coordinated response to global developments. But here's where this analysis becomes personally urgent for every viewer. The cultural conditioning that shaped human beliefs to make giant presence seem impossible, while facilitating giant objectives, continues to operate through entertainment, education, and media that promote materialistic worldviews while suppressing spiritual discernment. Contemporary culture systematically conditions people to dismiss supernatural explanations for observable phenomena, while accepting naturalistic interpretations that actually facilitate spiritual manipulation. The same psychological conditioning that prevented pre-flood populations from recognizing their true situation operates through modern forms that achieve identical results. The information control that suppressed evidence of giant survival operates through modern media ownership, search engine algorithms, and academic publication policies that limit public access to information, challenging established narratives. The mechanisms for controlling public awareness have become more sophisticated, but the underlying objectives remain constant. The crisis exploitation that enabled giant survival through catastrophic events finds its modern expression in manufactured emergencies, social engineering, and problem reaction solution strategies that implement desired changes while appearing to address legitimate concerns. Understanding this mechanism helps recognize when crises serve hidden agendas rather than addressing genuine problems. The spiritual warfare dimension that enabled giant rebellion against divine authority continues to operate through influences that shape human institutions, cultural developments, and individual choices in directions that serve rebellious rather than divine purposes. The same supernatural forces that produce the Nephilim continue to work toward corrupting human nature and opposing divine authority. But recognizing these patterns provides hope rather than despair, because understanding the enemy's strategies enables effective resistance. Just as Noah found grace in God's eyes and was preserved through judgment, those who recognize the signs of the times and remain faithful to divine truth will be protected and preserved through whatever challenges may come. The key lies in developing spiritual discernment that can recognize deceptive influences operating through apparently legitimate authorities and beneficial innovations. This requires understanding that the same conflict between divine authority and rebellious opposition that played out in Noah's day continues to unfold through human history using different methods but serving identical purposes. Personal preparation involves more than physical readiness for challenging times. It requires spiritual development that enables recognition of spiritual warfare operating through apparently natural processes and institutions. Understanding giant survival patterns provides frameworks for interpreting contemporary developments through spiritual rather than merely secular analysis. The educational implications require building alternative learning environments that promote biblical worldview while providing technical education necessary for effective cultural engagement. If mainstream educational institutions systematically suppress evidence for supernatural dimensions of history while promoting ideologies that facilitate spiritual manipulation, then believers need educational approaches that maintain spiritual discernment alongside intellectual development. The community implications involve building relationships with others who understand these spiritual warfare realities and can provide mutual support during potentially challenging times. Isolation becomes particularly dangerous when spiritual warfare involves forces with capabilities that exceed individual human resistance. Community provides resources for mutual encouragement and practical assistance while maintaining spiritual priorities. The technological implications require wisdom for using modern capabilities in ways that serve divine purposes, while avoiding dependency on systems that could facilitate control or manipulation by forces opposed to divine authority. Understanding giant technological capabilities provides frameworks for evaluating digital platforms, communication systems, and other technologies through spiritual as well as practical criteria. The family implications include protecting children from influences that serve giant objectives while providing positive alternatives that strengthen spiritual development and biblical worldview. Understanding giant survival patterns helps parents recognize educational, entertainment, and social influences that require careful evaluation rather than automatic acceptance. The economic implications involve developing financial strategies that serve divine purposes, while avoiding inadvertent support for systems or institutions that promote values contrary to biblical truth. Understanding giant institutional influence provides guidance for investment, spending, and charitable giving decisions that align with spiritual rather than merely economic criteria. The political implications require wisdom for engaging governmental systems while maintaining spiritual priorities and avoiding complicity with policies that serve giant objectives. Understanding giant institutional infiltration provides criteria for evaluating political candidates, policies, and movements through spiritual rather than merely partisan considerations. The health implications extend beyond physical wellness to include spiritual and psychological preparation for environments where deceptive influences operate through medical, psychological, and wellness systems that claim to serve human benefit while potentially serving manipulative purposes. Discernment becomes essential for distinguishing between genuine healing and deceptive control. The preparedness implications extend beyond physical readiness to include spiritual, emotional, and relational preparation for conditions that may involve challenges exceeding normal human capacity to address through purely human resources. Understanding giant capabilities provides realistic assessment of potential challenges while maintaining confidence in divine protection. The apologetic implications include presenting evidence for biblical reliability through giant survival documentation while addressing contemporary spiritual challenges that secular worldviews cannot adequately explain. Understanding giant reality provides compelling validation for supernatural dimensions of biblical narrative, while strengthening, rather than weakening, biblical authority. The prophetic implications involve recognizing contemporary developments that align with biblical predictions about end times conditions, while maintaining hope for divine intervention that will resolve cosmic conflict. Understanding giant survival patterns helps interpret current events through prophetic rather than merely secular frameworks. The evangelistic implications include presenting the gospel through frameworks that address contemporary spiritual challenges, while validating biblical authority through evidence that secular worldviews cannot adequately explain. Understanding giant survival provides compelling apologetic material while maintaining supernatural worldview and biblical commitment. But the ultimate implication involves recognizing that understanding giant survival changes everything about how we view spiritual warfare, biblical authority, and cosmic conflict, while providing practical wisdom for navigating contemporary challenges that may involve direct giant manifestation as global conditions approach patterns that historically preceded such intervention. The convergence of genetic manipulation, underground construction, technological advancement, cultural conditioning, and institutional infiltration all point toward the restoration of conditions similar to those that motivated divine judgment through the flood. But understanding these patterns provides opportunity for spiritual preparation rather than cause for despair. The same divine faithfulness that preserved Noah continues to operate today, providing protection and guidance for those who recognize the signs and remain faithful regardless of external circumstances. The question isn't whether these patterns will continue to unfold, but whether we'll position ourselves among those who understand the times and prepare accordingly. The story of Noah's Ark provides the template for divine preservation operating alongside divine judgment. The same principles that enabled survival through ancient catastrophe continue to operate today, offering hope for those who trust in divine rather than human solutions to the challenges we face. Understanding what really happened to the giants during the flood isn't just about solving an ancient mystery. It's about recognizing that the same spiritual warfare continues today through different methods, but with identical objectives. It's about developing the discernment necessary to navigate an increasingly deceptive world while maintaining faith in divine promises and protection. The evidence we've examined reveals that we're living in times that may be more significant than most people realize. The return of conditions similar to the days of Noah suggests that we're approaching a period of divine intervention that will resolve the cosmic conflict between good and evil once and for all. But until that resolution comes, our responsibility involves understanding the patterns, recognizing the signs, and positioning ourselves correctly for whatever challenges may arise. The same God who preserved Noah will preserve those who remain faithful today, providing wisdom, protection, and ultimate victory over all forces that oppose divine authority. The forbidden history behind Noah's Ark reveals that divine preservation operates according to principles that transcend human understanding, while providing practical guidance for those who seek truth rather than comfortable deception. Understanding these principles prepares us not just for academic knowledge, but for spiritual warfare that affects every aspect of human existence. The ultimate truth we've uncovered transforms everything we thought we knew about human history, divine judgment, and the cosmic conflict that continues to unfold around us every single day. Because what happened to the giants during Noah's flood wasn't just ancient history, it was the establishment of patterns that are accelerating toward their final culmination in our generation. When you step back and examine the complete picture, the evidence becomes overwhelming. The academic research validates supernatural interpretations of Genesis 6 through rigorous linguistic analysis. The historical documentation preserves detailed accounts of sophisticated survival strategies across cultures that had no contact with each other. The cultural traditions embed practical knowledge about underground construction and genetic preservation that exceeds what mainstream anthropology attributes to ancient civilizations. The modern discoveries continue to validate these ancient accounts through archaeological findings, genetic anomalies, and documented sightings that align perfectly with historical descriptions. The operational mechanisms reveal how spiritual warfare operates through apparently natural processes while serving supernatural agendas. And the prophetic implications connect all of this to biblical warnings about end times, conditions that will mirror the days of Noah. But here's what makes this absolutely critical for your life right now. We're not just studying ancient mysteries, we're decoding the blueprint for what's happening in our world today. The same forces that produced genetic corruption before the flood are advancing genetic manipulation technologies at unprecedented rates. The same mechanisms that enabled giant survival through catastrophic judgment are being implemented through modern underground installations and preservation systems. The same institutional infiltration that preserved giant influence through post-flood civilizations continues to operate through educational, governmental, and corporate structures that promote ideologies contrary to biblical truth, while systematically suppressing spiritual discernment. The same cultural conditioning that prevented ancient populations from recognizing their true situation operates through contemporary media and entertainment that shapes worldviews to facilitate spiritual manipulation. Think about where this trajectory leads. If these patterns continue accelerating at current rates, We're approaching conditions that will exceed anything experienced since the original flood judgment. But here's the crucial difference. This time, the preservation won't come through water, but through fire. This time, the division won't be between those who enter the ark and those who don't, but between those who maintain spiritual discernment and those who accept the deception. The genetic manipulation technologies being developed today promise to achieve the same enhancements that characterized the pre-flood Nephilim: extraordinary size, supernatural abilities, extended lifespans. The artificial intelligence systems being deployed exceed human cognitive capabilities in ways that mirror ancient accounts of beings with knowledge beyond normal human comprehension. The underground construction projects being undertaken globally provide survival capabilities that echo the installations that enabled giant persistence through divine judgment. But the most significant parallel involves the spiritual dimension. The same supernatural forces that enabled the production of hybrid beings before the flood continue to operate through influences that shape human institutions, cultural developments, and technological advancement. The goal remains identical: to corrupt human nature beyond God's original design, to create beings that transcend divine limitations, and to establish authority independent from divine rule. This is why understanding what happened to the giants becomes personally urgent for every person alive today, because the patterns we've uncovered aren't just historical curiosities, they're warnings about what's coming and instructions for how to prepare. The preservation strategies that enable giant survival through divine judgment provide frameworks for understanding how opposition to divine authority persists through changing circumstances while maintaining core objectives. The same technological sophistication, institutional infiltration, and cultural conditioning continue to operate through modern forms that achieve identical results through different methods. But recognizing these patterns provides hope rather than despair, because the same divine faithfulness that preserved Noah operates today with even greater power through Christ's redemptive work. The same divine authority that ultimately defeated the giants continues to reign supreme over all created beings, regardless of their capabilities or strategies. Understanding giant survival reveals that divine patience allows rebellion to reach full development before final judgment, but divine justice ensures that no opposition can ultimately succeed against divine purposes. The sophisticated survival strategies that enabled giant persistence through flood judgment ultimately served divine goals by demonstrating both the persistence of corruption and the certainty of divine victory. This means that contemporary manifestations of these ancient patterns, no matter how sophisticated or concerning they appear, remain subject to divine sovereignty and serve ultimate divine purposes for human redemption and cosmic restoration. The genetic manipulation, technological advancement, and cultural conditioning we observe today will ultimately contribute to conditions that necessitate divine intervention and resolution. But here's where personal responsibility becomes crucial. Understanding these patterns creates obligations for spiritual preparation, community building, and truth sharing that can't be ignored. Those who recognize the signs of the times have responsibilities to others who may benefit from enhanced spiritual discernment and historical understanding. The educational implications require building alternative learning environments that maintain biblical worldview while providing practical skills necessary for cultural engagement. The community implications involve establishing relationships that can provide mutual support during potentially challenging times. The technological implications demand wisdom for using modern capabilities in ways that serve divine rather than corrupting purposes. The family implications include protecting children from influences that serve ancient corrupting agendas while providing positive alternatives that strengthen spiritual development. The economic implications involve financial strategies that avoid inadvertent support for systems that promote values contrary to biblical truth. The political implications require engagement that maintains spiritual priorities while avoiding complicity with policies that facilitate spiritual manipulation. The health implications extend beyond physical wellness to spiritual and psychological preparation for environments where deceptive influences operate through apparently beneficial systems. The preparedness implications encompass spiritual, emotional, and relational readiness for challenges that may exceed normal human capacity to address through purely human resources. But the most important implication involves personal relationship with the divine authority that reigns supreme over all these forces. Understanding giant survival demonstrates that no created beings, regardless of their capabilities or strategies, can ultimately frustrate divine purposes or prevent divine victory. This provides confidence and hope that transcends any external circumstances while motivating faithful participation in spiritual warfare that serves eternal objectives. The prophetic timeline suggests that we may be approaching the culmination of patterns that have operated throughout human history since the flood. The acceleration of genetic manipulation, underground construction, technological advancement, and cultural conditioning all point toward restoration of conditions that will necessitate divine intervention on scales not seen since Noah's day. But this intervention won't come as judgment alone. It will come as redemption for those who remain faithful while establishing divine authority over all creation in ways that eliminate future possibility of rebellion or corruption. The cosmic conflict between divine authority and rebellious opposition will reach its resolution through processes that vindicate divine character while demonstrating divine power to all created beings. Understanding what happened to the giants provides preparation for participating in this cosmic resolution, rather than being swept away by deceptive forces that promote false solutions to genuine human needs. The same spiritual discernment that enabled Noah to recognize divine warnings and prepare accordingly remains available today for those who seek truth rather than comfortable deception. The story of Noah's Ark reveals divine preservation principles that continue to operate through changing historical circumstances while maintaining consistent spiritual dynamics. Those who align themselves with divine authority, maintain genetic and spiritual integrity, and resist corrupting influences will be preserved and protected regardless of external challenges or opposition capabilities. This isn't about predicting specific dates or times, but about recognizing patterns that help interpret contemporary developments through spiritual, rather than merely secular frameworks. When we see unprecedented genetic manipulation, massive underground construction, advanced technological development, and systematic cultural conditioning, we're witnessing the acceleration of ancient patterns toward their prophetic fulfillment. The ultimate message isn't one of fear, but of divine faithfulness that provides hope and guidance for those who trust in divine rather than human solutions. The same God who preserved humanity through Noah's lineage continues to work for human redemption while preparing for cosmic restoration that will exceed anything previously experienced. Understanding giant survival equips us with spiritual discernment necessary for navigating increasingly deceptive environments while maintaining faith in divine promises and protection. It provides practical wisdom for making decisions about education, relationships, career, and preparation that serve eternal rather than merely temporal objectives. But most importantly, it reminds us that we're participants in cosmic conflict that affects outcomes beyond our individual experience, while serving divine purposes that transcend current circumstances. The evidence we've examined reveals that human history operates according to spiritual principles that most people never recognize, but which become visible to those who understand the patterns. The forbidden history behind Noah's Ark isn't just about solving ancient mysteries. It's about recognizing our position in ongoing spiritual warfare and positioning ourselves correctly for whatever challenges and opportunities may arise. Because if these patterns are accurate, we may be approaching times that will test human faith and spiritual discernment in ways not experienced since the days of Noah himself. The question isn't whether these patterns will continue to unfold. The question is whether we'll recognize them, understand their significance, and position ourselves among those who remain faithful regardless of external circumstances. The same divine authority that judged the giants while preserving Noah continues to reign supreme, providing wisdom, protection, and ultimate victory for those who trust in divine rather than human solutions. The story continues, and your part in it matters more than you might realize. Because understanding what really happened to the giants during the flood prepares us not just for academic knowledge, but for spiritual warfare that will determine the eternal trajectory of human civilization itself.